In a move that has sparked national debate and drawn sharp criticism from local leaders, President Donald Trump announced plans to deploy federal troops to Portland, Oregon, citing the need to restore law and order amid ongoing protests and civil unrest. The deployment of federal troops to Portland, Oregon, by President Donald Trump was a pivotal moment that stirred national debate and raised critical questions about the balance of power, civil liberties, and public safety in the United States. The context behind this decision traces back to the widespread protests that erupted across the country following the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May 2020. While most demonstrations were peaceful, some cities, including Portland, saw extended unrest, sporadic violence, vandalism, and clashes with law enforcement. Portland, in particular, became a flashpoint with nightly protests that continued for weeks, often centered around the federal courthouse and other government properties in the downtown area. President Trump, who campaigned and governed heavily on a law and order platform, saw the unrest in Portland not merely as a local crisis, but as a national threat and an opportunity to demonstrate federal strength. As protests persisted and incidents of vandalism and property damage were reported near federal buildings, Trump directed the Department of Homeland Security to send in federal agents, many of whom were from specialized units such as Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the U.S. Marshals Service. These agents, often wearing military-style uniforms with minimal identification, were tasked with protecting federal facilities, but their actions quickly expanded beyond those limits. The move was framed by the Trump administration as necessary to counter what it labeled anarchist activity. Trump and his officials argued that local authorities had lost control of the city and were either unwilling or unable to restore order. He claimed that the federal government had the obligation to step in to safeguard federal property and enforce the rule of law. To his supporters, this action was a strong, decisive response to chaos and lawlessness, a clear message that violent demonstrations would not be tolerated and that the federal government would take any action necessary to maintain security. However, the reality on the ground painted a more complicated picture. The presence of federal agents in Portland did not de-escalate the situation. In fact, it appeared to inflame tensions further. Protesters, who had already been demanding justice and reform in policing, now found themselves confronting heavily armed federal forces that many saw as an occupying presence. Clashes intensified. Videos and eyewitness reports showed federal agents using tear gas, rubber bullets, and forceful tactics on demonstrators. Perhaps most controversially, unmarked vehicles were used to detain individuals without clear identification or explanation, a tactic that drew comparisons to authoritarian regimes and ignited a fierce backlash from civil rights advocates. The lack of coordination with local and state officials was another major issue. Oregon Governor Kate Brown and Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler both publicly condemned the federal intervention. They argued that it was unnecessary, unconstitutional, and deliberately provocative. Rather than calming the unrest, they said the arrival of federal forces had given the protests a new focus: opposition to federal overreach. What had begun as a local movement for racial justice morphed into a broader resistance against what was seen as federal authoritarianism. Legal scholars and former law enforcement officials expressed concern about the precedent this set. The use of federal power against American citizens, especially without the invitation or consent of local governments, was seen as a dangerous erosion of democratic norms. The Posse Comitatus Act, which limits the use of federal military personnel in domestic law enforcement, was not technically violated, since the troops were not military per se. But the spirit of the law was undeniably tested. At the same time, the administration's defenders argued that cities like Portland were spiraling out of control and that the federal government had a legitimate right to protect its assets. They pointed to images of fires, graffiti, and broken windows as evidence that local leaders had lost their grip. In this view, federal intervention was not only justified but long overdue, a necessary check against what they saw as permissive, left-leaning city officials who failed to enforce the law. Yet, even within federal circles, there was disagreement about the strategy. Reports emerged of confusion among federal agencies, a lack of clear command structure, and inadequate training for urban crowd control. Some agents were reportedly unfamiliar with the legal boundaries of their role, leading to mistakes that further eroded public trust. Ultimately, the deployment of federal troops to Portland became a national Rorschach test. To some, it symbolized strength, order, and patriotism, a stand against chaos. To others, it represented government overreach, suppression of dissent, and the erosion of civil liberties. It raised urgent questions about the proper limits of federal power, the role of protest in a democracy, and the responsibilities of leadership in times of unrest. This moment also underscored the deep polarization in American society. Even basic facts, such as the nature of the protests or the legality of federal actions, were filtered through partisan lenses. Media outlets, politicians, and the public interpreted events according to their pre-existing beliefs, often talking past each other rather than engaging in meaningful dialogue. The federal deployment became more than just a law enforcement issue. It became a symbol in the larger cultural and political war gripping the nation. In retrospect, the episode in Portland was a powerful illustration of how governance, law enforcement, and civil liberties collide in moments of crisis. It showed the risks of unilateral federal action without local support, the dangers of escalation in volatile situations, and the fine line between security and suppression. Whether seen as a necessary move or a grave overstep, President Trump's decision to send troops to Portland left a lasting imprint on the national consciousness, one that will be debated for years to come as America continues to grapple with the meaning of justice, protest, and power. The controversy surrounding the federal intervention in Portland, Oregon, during the Trump administration was not merely about law enforcement. It was about power, autonomy, and the delicate balance between federal authority and local governance. The deployment of federal agents into an American city without the consent of state or local officials sparked intense debate across the country, revealing fault lines in American democracy and raising serious constitutional concerns. For many, the use of federal force in Portland was not just an issue of law and order. It was a bold political maneuver that represented a deeper shift in the relationship between the federal government and the people it serves. The decision by President Donald Trump to send federal agents, many from the Department of Homeland Security, including units from Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection, into Portland, was made unilaterally. Neither Oregon Governor Kate Brown nor Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler requested the assistance. In fact, they both vehemently opposed it. Local leaders stated unequivocally that the situation in Portland, while tense, was under control, and that outside intervention would only inflame the situation. Their warnings were prescient. Far from calming the protests, the presence of federal agents escalated the conflict, turning what had been localized demonstrations focused on racial justice and police reform into broader protests against federal overreach and authoritarianism. The controversy centered on several specific tactics used by federal agents. Protesters and observers reported that agents, dressed in military-style fatigues and lacking clear identification, were detaining individuals off the streets and placing them into unmarked vehicles. These detentions were carried out without clear explanations or arrest warrants, often without informing local law enforcement or following standard procedures. To many legal experts and civil rights advocates, this appeared to be a clear violation of constitutional protections, particularly those enshrined in the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, which guard against unlawful searches, seizures, and deprivation of liberty without due process. This kind of federal action set off alarms among civil liberties organizations, including the ACLU, which filed lawsuits challenging the legality of the detentions. Critics warned that the federal government was operating outside its bounds, acting with impunity and ignoring the sovereignty of local governments. Portland, a city known for its progressive values and strong civil society, became the ground zero for a new kind of domestic conflict, one not just between protesters and law enforcement, but between different levels of government fighting over who had the right to govern and protect the people. Opponents of the deployment accused the Trump administration of using Portland as a political stage. With a presidential election approaching, Trump leaned heavily into a narrative of chaos in Democrat-run cities. He painted Portland as a city under siege, a lawless place where anarchists and radicals ruled the streets. By sending in federal agents, he positioned himself as the last line of defense between order and collapse. It was a powerful political message aimed at his base, many of whom viewed urban protests with suspicion and felt alienated by the social justice movements sweeping the country. The federal crackdown in Portland, therefore, served a dual purpose. It acted as a real show of force and as a symbolic gesture designed to reinforce Trump's image as a strong leader standing up to perceived threats from the left. But this strategy came at a cost. The visible and aggressive presence of federal agents deepened the divide between Washington and local governments. Oregon officials publicly called on the administration to withdraw the agents, arguing that their continued presence was illegal and destabilizing. Governor Brown stated that the deployment had turned a tense but manageable situation into a full-blown crisis. Mayor Wheeler, who himself had been the target of criticism for his handling of the protests, said that the federal response was making the city less safe, not more. When he personally visited a protest site to speak to demonstrators, he was tear-gassed by federal agents, an incident that made headlines nationwide and further underscored the chaotic nature of the intervention. The resistance to federal involvement wasn't limited to Portland. Across the nation, cities and states watched closely, concerned about the precedent being set. If the federal government could deploy armed agents to Portland without consent, what would stop it from doing the same in other cities? Could federal power be used selectively to target political opponents? These were the questions that began to surface as the Portland crisis unfolded, and they touched on the most fundamental principles of American governance. Principles designed to limit centralized authority and preserve the autonomy of local institutions. Despite the backlash, the Trump administration defended its actions. Officials insisted that the federal government had every right to protect its property and personnel, regardless of local opposition. They pointed to the damage sustained by federal buildings and the violence seen in some protests as justification. To them, this was not about politics, but about fulfilling a duty to maintain law and order. But even this rationale was met with skepticism. Many noted that the violence in Portland was relatively localized and that it had been declining before the federal agents arrived. Their presence, far from quelling the unrest, appeared to provoke it. In the aftermath, the intervention in Portland became a case study in the misuse of federal power. It highlighted the dangers of politicizing law enforcement and showed how easily democratic norms can be strained when power is wielded without accountability. The episode also became a rallying cry for civil rights advocates and reformers who used it to argue for stronger safeguards against government overreach and better oversight of federal law enforcement agencies. More broadly, the Portland controversy symbolized a growing distrust in institutions and a fear that political agendas were beginning to erode the principles of American democracy. It showed how the lines between national security, civil liberties, and political theater can blur in moments of crisis. The federal deployment may have been justified on paper by the need to protect federal assets, but in practice, it raised far more questions than it answered. It provoked outrage, galvanized protests, and left a lasting scar on the city and the country. This incident ultimately forced Americans to grapple with critical questions about power, freedom, and justice. Who gets to decide how cities are governed? What are the limits of federal authority? How do we balance the need for security with the right to dissent? In Portland, those questions were no longer theoretical. They played out in real time, on real streets, with real consequences. And the answers will shape the nation's future long after the tear gas has cleared. The deployment of federal troops to Portland, Oregon, under President Trump marked a significant and deeply controversial chapter in American political and civil discourse. While the administration claimed it was a necessary step to restore order and protect federal property, the move ignited widespread outrage, raised constitutional concerns, and heightened tensions both on the streets and within the halls of government. It brought into sharp focus the delicate balance between national authority and local autonomy, the proper limits of law enforcement, and the role of protest in a democratic society.